One company, based in Shanghai, built more ships by tonnage in 2024 than the entire United States shipbuilding industry has built since the end of World War II. Not in the same decade, not in the same generation. Since 1945, 80 years of American commercial shipbuilding output in a single year from a single state-owned Chinese enterprise. That company is China's State Shipbuilding Corporation, known as CSSC. You have almost certainly never heard of it. The ships it builds carry the containers covered throughout this series, get loaded by the ZPMC cranes this channel has already covered, and transport everything from oil to cars to the electronics sitting in your home. In 2024, China captured approximately 70% of all new global ship orders. South Korea captured most of the rest. The United States, Germany, Britain, Sweden, and every other nation that once had significant shipbuilding industries combined to account for less than 5%. This did not happen by accident. It happened the same way China came to dominate container manufacturing, port cranes, and port terminal operations, through a combination of state capital, strategic pricing, and a 40-year patience that no privately funded competitor could match. In 1950, Great Britain launched more ships than any other country on Earth. British yards built 1/3 of the world's commercial fleet in the immediate post-war years. Sweden's yards, Kockums and Gotha Werken, supplied large tankers to the global oil trade and were considered among the most technically sophisticated in the world. West Germany rebuilt its shipbuilding industry from wartime disruption to become a significant exporter by the 1960s. American yards, still flush with wartime production capacity, built ships for domestic routes and military use. By 1980, none of this mattered. Japan had industrialized its shipbuilding sector with government support in the 1950s and 1960s and had taken the top global position. Japanese yards offered lower prices and faster delivery times. They used assembly line methods adapted from the automobile industry. British and Swedish yards, operating with higher labor costs and less government support, found it impossible to match Japanese prices. They closed or consolidated across the 1960s and 1970s. Germany held on longer in specialized segments but progressively withdrew from commodity vessel construction. Then South Korea did to Japan what Japan had done to the West. In the early 1970s, South Korean President Park Chung-hee designated heavy industry, including shipbuilding, as a national strategic priority. The state directed capital toward building the infrastructure that a modern yard requires: dry docks over 400 meters long, steel supply chains through the newly created POSCO Steel Company, engineering training at scale. Hyundai Heavy Industries, which would eventually become one of the largest shipbuilding companies in the world, broke ground on its first yard in 1972 on a timeline that seemed impossible. It delivered its first ship in 1974. 2 years later, before the yard was technically finished, South Korean yards entered the market below Japanese prices. They sustained losses during the period required to establish production scale and earn customer trust. The Korean government provided financing, guaranteed contracts, and absorbed the transition costs that no private company could have survived. By the 1990s, South Korea had overtaken Japan. Korean yards built complex vessels, LNG carriers, container ships, and heavy-lift vessels that required engineering precision the Japanese had previously monopolized. The pattern was identical to what the channel has described for port cranes and shipping containers. State capital absorbs losses that private competitors cannot. Prices are set below what the market will sustain long-term. Competitors exit. Market share concentrates. Once established, the scale advantage becomes self-reinforcing: lower costs, faster delivery, deeper supplier networks. China applied the same model to shipbuilding in the late 1990s and accelerated it through the 2000s. The Chinese government identified shipbuilding as a pillar industry under its industrial planning framework. CSSC and its counterpart China Shipbuilding Industry Corporation were state-owned enterprises with access to capital from state banks at terms private yards in Korea or Japan could not access. China began with the least complex vessels, bulk carriers and simple tankers, the commodity end of the market where price is the dominant competitive variable. Chinese yards priced below Korean competitors. The price gap was financed by state bank lending to the shipyard and by subsidized financing offered to buyers, with China's state-owned export bank providing ship purchase loans at interest rates significantly below commercial rates. A Greek shipping company ordering a bulk carrier from a Chinese yard could access Chinese state financing at 2 to 3%. The same buyer borrowing from a Western bank to order from a Korean yard paid 6 to 8%. The difference in financing cost over a 20-year loan was millions of dollars per ship, a subsidy embedded in the financial structure rather than the headline price. South Korean yards responded by moving upmarket into higher-value vessels. LNG carriers requiring precision cryogenic engineering, large container ships, Plex offshore equipment for a decade. This strategy maintained South Korean competitiveness in premium segments while ceding the bulk and tanker market to China. China followed them upmarket. By 2024, China dominated new orders in bulk carriers, tankers, and container ships, and had surpassed South Korea in liquefied petroleum gas carrier orders. China received 70% of global green energy ship orders across all major vessel types in the first 9 months of 2024, including the methanol and LNG ships the previous script covered. The segment South Korea had protected as its technological refuge, complex alternative fuel vessels, China entered and began winning. The American position in this story is in a category of its own. The United States accounts for approximately 0.1% of global commercial shipbuilding output. The Jones Act, which this channel has covered previously, maintains a small domestic shipbuilding industry for vessels operating between U.S. ports. Those ships cost 3 to 4 times what an equivalent vessel costs from an Asian yard, protected by a regulatory requirement that has no equivalent in commercial international shipping. For the international fleet, America is entirely absent. U.S. ports receive ships from Chinese and Korean yards. U.S. companies charter ships built in Chinese and Korean yards. The U.S. military relies on a commercial shipbuilding and repair base that barely exists. The Trump administration moved directly against Chinese shipbuilding in 2025. Section 31 fees targeting Chinese-built ships calling at U.S. ports were proposed and briefly implemented before suspension under a trade agreement. The Ships for America Act proposed further penalties on vessels linked to Chinese state shipbuilders. The stated goal was to create financial pressure that would redirect orders to South Korean and eventually American yards. The constraint that shipbuilding analysts identified immediately was capacity. BIMCO, the world's largest shipping association, stated the problem plainly. Even if ship owners tried to avoid Chinese yards, there was a limit to the capacity available outside China. If global ship contracting had not significantly dropped at the same time, China's share of contracting would likely have remained near its peak regardless of the U.S. fees. Building a shipyard capable of competing at scale requires years of construction, billions in capital, a trained workforce, and a supplier network for specialized components. American yards produced essentially nothing at commercial scale for 40 years. The institutional knowledge, the skilled workforce, and the industrial ecosystem required to rebuild do not exist in warehouses waiting to be reopened. They have to be reconstructed from near zero. The result of this 40-year process is a global shipbuilding industry with a concentration that matches what this channel has documented in every other component of the maritime system. 2 countries build essentially all new ships. One of them is a strategic rival of the world's largest economy, building ships at a pace that no private competitor can match, supplying the vessels that carry a third of global trade, and doing so with state financing structures that make the economics of the industry function differently than any other market. The ship that eventually brings your next major purchase to a port near you was almost certainly built in a yard you have never heard of in a country whose national strategic plan included that ship's construction. The container was made by CIMC. The crane that unloaded it was made by ZPMC. The terminal it passed through may be operated by a Dubai or Chinese-linked company, and now the ship itself fits into the same pattern. The maritime supply chain, from the building of the vessel to its final unloading, is one of the most concentrated industrial systems in the global economy. It arrived at that concentration the same way every time, through state-backed capital absorbing losses that market competition would never have permitted. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.